December 1944. Western Europe was locked in ice. The forests of the Ardennes lay buried beneath thick snow, their branches heavy and silent under a steel-gray sky. For months, Allied forces had pushed the German army back across France. Paris had been liberated, supply lines stretched eastward. Many believed the war in Europe was entering its final phase. The men stationed in the Ardennes believed it too. This sector was considered quiet, a place to rest exhausted divisions, to rotate inexperienced soldiers into the line, to recover from the relentless fighting of the summer and fall. The terrain was rough, the roads narrow, the forests dense. It was not considered ideal for a major offensive. That assumption would prove catastrophic. Before dawn on December 16th, the silence shattered. German artillery opened fire along a 60-mile front. Thousands of shells screamed through the freezing air and crashed into American positions. The bombardment was sudden, overwhelming, and precise. Telephone wires were severed, command posts were destroyed, men were killed before they could even grab their helmets. It was the opening move of what history would call the Battle of the Bulge. The German plan was bold, desperate even. Adolf Hitler had ordered a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, hoping to split British and American forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into negotiations. Nearly 200,000 German troops, supported by tanks and heavy artillery, surged forward under cover of snow and fog. Speed and surprise were their greatest weapons. In one small sector near a Belgian village, an American infantry battalion was caught directly in the path of the assault. Among them was a forward artillery observer, a quiet, disciplined officer whose role was both technical and deadly. He did not command a rifle squad. He did not lead a charge. His weapon was mathematics. His power was a radio. From his position near the front lines, he was responsible for directing artillery fire from batteries positioned miles behind the lines. Every shell that fell depended on his coordinates. Every adjustment could mean the difference between saving friendly troops or killing them. That morning, as the German barrage intensified, he pressed his headset tighter against his ears and tried to make sense of the chaos. Reports came in broken fragments. Enemy armor sighted, infantry advancing through the trees, left flank collapsing. The fog made visibility almost impossible. Snow muted the sound of movement. German troops used the dense forest to mask their advance. Some wore white camouflage smocks, blending into the winter landscape like ghosts. The first wave hit before many Americans fully understood what was happening. Machine gun fire ripped through tree lines. Mortar rounds burst overhead, showering men with splinters of wood and frozen earth. German assault units moved aggressively, bypassing strong points and pushing deep into rear areas. Their objective was not just to engage, it was to disorient, isolate, and break the defensive structure entirely. Within hours, entire American units were cut off. Roads became clogged with retreating vehicles, wounded soldiers, and abandoned equipment. Police tried desperately to restore order. Officers shouted conflicting commands over the thunder of artillery. The observer climbed to a slightly elevated position near the edge of the forest, scanning through binoculars. He could see movement between the trees. Not scattered patrols, formations, disciplined, coordinated, hundreds of them. He relayed his first fire mission of the day, voice steady despite the tremor in the ground beneath him. Grid coordinates, elevation, distance. Miles away, American artillery crews adjusted their guns. Moments later, the sky tore open again, this time in response. Shells crashed into the advancing German columns, throwing up fountains of snow and shattered timber. For a moment, the advance slowed, but it did not stop. More German units poured through the gaps. Tanks rumbled along narrow forest roads. Infantry fanned outward, probing for weak points. The scale of the assault became horrifyingly clear. This was not a raid. It was an offensive designed to break the Allied line in half. By midday, communication with adjacent American units began to fail.
Field telephones went dead, radio signals dissolved into static. Messengers sent through the forest did not return. The observer requested updated situation reports. There were none. The battalion commander made a grim decision: hold position. If they retreated without orders, the breakthrough could widen. If they held, they might buy time for reinforcements to reorganize behind them. Time, that was the currency now. Throughout the afternoon, the fighting intensified. German troops infiltrated through wooded ravines, appearing suddenly at dangerously close range. American machine gunners fired until their barrels smoked. Riflemen rationed ammunition carefully, aware resupply might not come. Snow turned pink and then red. The observer continued adjusting artillery fire with relentless focus. Each correction was smaller, closer, more urgent. He knew something others were only beginning to realize. The Germans were not just attacking from the front, they were moving around them. By late afternoon, scouts reported enemy presence behind their lines. A supply convoy attempting to withdraw had been ambushed. The main road to the west, their only reliable escape route, was no longer secure. The circle was tightening. As daylight began to fade, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost clung to uniforms stiff with sweat. Breath hung visibly in the air. The battlefield grew darker, more confusing, more dangerous. The observer attempted contact with higher headquarters. Static. He tried again. A faint response came through, fragmented, barely audible. The message was incomplete, but the meaning was clear enough. German breakthrough confirmed. Multiple units surrounded. Hold if possible. Hold if possible. He lowered the radio slowly. In the distance, through gaps in the trees, he could see flickers of movement, not retreating figures, but advancing ones, organized, deliberate, hundreds of them. He understood the mathematics of artillery. He understood range. He understood blast radius. What he did not yet know, what no one could know, was that within hours, those calculations would become a matter of life and death, not just for his unit, but for himself. The forest that had once seemed like protection was now a cage, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, hundreds of German soldiers were closing in. The breakthrough was complete. The encirclement had begun.
Night fell fast in the Ardennes. By the time the last gray light disappeared behind the trees, the American position was no longer part of a defensive line. It was an island, surrounded by darkness, cut off from support, and hunted. The temperature dropped below freezing. Men huddled in shallow foxholes, their uniforms stiff with ice, their fingers numb inside wool gloves. Frost formed on rifle barrels, breath crystallized in the air. Every sound seemed magnified: the snap of a twig, the distant crunch of boots in snow, the metallic click of a weapon being readied somewhere beyond sight. The forward artillery observer adjusted his headset and tried once more to raise battalion headquarters. Static. Then a faint voice, distorted, broken. Enemy breakthrough confirmed, multiple sectors lost, hold your ground. The signal vanished again. Hold your ground. He lowered the radio slowly and looked around at the men near him. They were exhausted. Some were barely more than boys. Their faces were streaked with dirt and powder burns, eyes wide with the awareness that something had gone terribly wrong. A runner arrived from the eastern perimeter, breathless. "Sir, they're behind us. We saw movement past the ridge, at least a platoon, maybe more." That confirmed it. The Germans had not only pushed forward, they had flowed around them, sealing the road and cutting off retreat. Encirclement. The word carried weight far heavier than the snow pressing down on the trees. Encirclement meant no resupply, no evacuation for the wounded, no reinforcement, no retreat. Only endurance, only survival. Hours earlier, the German offensive had exploded across the Ardennes in what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. Now, in this small, forgotten patch of forest, its consequences were becoming brutally personal. Shortly after midnight, the first surrender demand came. A voice echoed through the trees in accented English. "American soldiers, you are completely surrounded. Lay down your weapons and you will not be harmed." The words carried clearly through the frozen air. Some of the younger soldiers shifted uncomfortably. The idea of survival, of simply walking out alive, had undeniable appeal. The observer remained silent for a moment. He had seen what happened to units that surrendered during rapid offensives. He also knew something else. If this position fell quickly, the Germans would gain access to the road beyond, a key route for American reserves trying to reorganize behind the breakthrough. This patch of snow-covered forest was not meaningless. It was a hinge. If it broke, the door would open wider. He keyed his radio again and reached the artillery battery still operating miles to the west. "Request fire mission. Grid coordinates." He gave the numbers calmly. Moments later, distant thunder rolled through the hills. Shells began landing beyond their perimeter, explosions lighting up the forest in blinding flashes. Snow erupted into black clouds, shattered branches rained down. German movement slowed, but it did not stop. Through binoculars, even in near darkness, he could see shadows advancing between trees, organized, disciplined, not scattered patrols, companies. Estimates circulated among the officers: 500, maybe 600 German troops in the immediate area. 600 against fewer than 100 Americans. The math was merciless. At 0200 hours, the Germans tested the western flank. Machine guns opened suddenly. Tracer rounds streaked red through the darkness. American riflemen fired controlled bursts, conserving ammunition. The clash was sharp and violent, but brief. The Germans withdrew, probing rather than committing. They were measuring resistance. The observer adjusted artillery again, walking shells closer to suspected assembly points. Each correction required careful calculation: distance, elevation, wind. Too far, and it would be useless. Too close, and fragments could tear into his own men. Add 200. Left 50. Fire for effect. The ground trembled with each impact. By dawn, the Americans had repelled 3 probing assaults, but ammunition was running dangerously low. Medical supplies were worse. The aid station consisted of a shallow depression covered by a torn canvas sheet. Inside, a medic worked with shaking hands, bandaging wounds in near darkness. Morphine syrettes were nearly gone. Blankets were stiff with frozen blood. The observer visited briefly, standing the injured. One young private gripped his sleeve. "Sir, they're not going to break through, right?" He paused. "No," he said evenly. "Not today." Outside, the gray light of morning revealed the scale of their isolation. Tracks in the snow surrounded their position on nearly every side. German footprints crisscrossed the forest floor. Abandoned equipment lay scattered from the previous night's fighting. Then came the second surrender demand, this time closer. A German officer stepped partially into view between trees, holding a white cloth. "You are surrounded by superior forces. Further resistance is useless." The American commander looked toward the observer. The decision was silent, but understood. They would not surrender. The white cloth disappeared. Moments later, mortar rounds began falling with terrifying accuracy. The Germans were tightening the noose. By late morning, coordinated attacks came from 3 directions. Infantry advanced in squads, covering each other with machine gun fire. Snipers targeted anyone who exposed themselves above the lip of a foxhole. The perimeter shrank. Positions that were 50 meters apart were now 20. The observer crawled from one position to another, checking angles of fire, relaying corrections. Snow soaked through his uniform. His gloves were stiff with ice. His radio operator stayed close, protecting the fragile equipment as if it were gold. Because it was. Without that radio, they were already dead. Another report came in. German troops had been spotted less than 150 meters behind their original rear line. The circle was complete. 600 German troops had sealed off the area.
The Americans were now a pocket in enemy territory. The observer checked his map again. If the Germans overran this position, they would capture artillery maps, call signs, coded frequencies, information that could cripple supporting batteries and open a corridor deeper into Allied territory. This was no longer just about survival. It was about denial, about buying time, about preventing a breakthrough from becoming a collapse. By early afternoon, the Germans launched their heaviest assault yet. Machine guns hammered continuously. Mortars walked methodically across the American lines. Tree bursts showered fragments downward like steel rain. The observer called artillery again. Closer now, much closer. "Drop 100 meters." The reply crackled through the headset. "Confirm. Danger close." He confirmed. Shells crashed just beyond their forward foxholes, sending shockwaves through the frozen ground. German attackers were thrown backward, but still they regrouped. The distance was shrinking. 50 meters, 40, 30. American riflemen could now see faces between trees. Grenades began flying both directions, small black shapes arcing through white air before erupting in thunderclaps. The observer felt something shift inside him, not fear exactly, but clarity. There were no reserves coming, no armored relief column racing through the snow. The weather browned air support. Roads were blocked. They were alone. And the Germans were preparing for one final push. The observer glanced at the artillery grid one more time. He knew the blast radius of high explosive shells. He knew what happened to men caught within it. He also knew what would happen if 600 German troops broke through this position. More American units would be surrounded. Supply lines would collapse further. The bulge in the Allied line would widen. This small patch of snow-covered forest mattered. The radio crackled again with incoming chatter, fragmented reports from other collapsing sectors. Enemy armor advancing, falling back, cannot hold. He took a slow breath. German officers were now visible just beyond rifle range, directing their men. The next assault would not be a probe. It would be decisive. The observer turned to his radio operator. "Get me the battery, Commander." Static. Then a response. "Battery ready." He looked out at the snow-covered forest, now filled with movement. 600 enemy troops closing in, a perimeter barely holding, wounded men unable to retreat. He understood the mathematics completely now. Distance, blast pattern, survival probability. And he realized something chilling. To stop them, the shells would have to land almost on top of their own position. He lifted the microphone slowly. The decision was seconds away. The forest went strangely quiet, the kind of silence that comes just before a storm breaks. And in that frozen stillness, surrounded by 600 enemy troops, he prepared to make the call that would define everything that followed.
The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. After hours of probing attacks and mortar fire, the sudden silence felt heavier than the explosions. Smoke drifted low between shattered trees. Snow, once white and untouched, was torn open by craters and stained dark by earth and blood. The forward artillery observer knelt in the freezing slush, radio pressed to his ear. He could hear movement now. Not distant, not uncertain. Close. Too close. German infantry were assembling for a final assault. Through gaps in the broken tree line, he could see figures crouched behind stumps and fallen trunks, officers signaling, machine guns being repositioned, mortar teams adjusting their tubes. This would not be another test. This would be the breakthrough. Behind him, the American perimeter had collapsed into a tight, desperate circle. Foxholes were nearly connected now. Wounded men lay wrapped in frozen bandages, rifles resting across their chests. Ammunition was being counted round by round. One of the sergeants crawled toward him. "They're forming up, sir. Maybe 50 yards out.
maybe less. 50 yards, 45 meters. In artillery terms, that distance was almost nothing. He looked down at the map board resting against his knee. The grid lines were smudged with mud and melting snow. His pencil trembled slightly in his glove, not from fear, but from cold. He keyed the microphone. "Battery, this is Observer. Adjust fire. New grid coordinates to follow." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Send it." He gave the numbers. They were close. Very close. A moment later, the artillery battery miles away began adjusting their guns. Steel breech blocks slammed shut. Charges were loaded. Elevation angles recalculated. Back in the forest, the Germans began advancing again. The assault came in waves, disciplined, controlled. Machine guns opened first, raking the American position with suppressing fire. Mortars followed, shells landing just behind the shrinking perimeter to prevent escape. American riflemen returned fire, but their lines were thin now. The Observer listened for the distant sound. Then it came, a low, rolling thunder that grew rapidly louder. The first shells screamed overhead. They landed just beyond the German advance, throwing up columns of frozen soil and splintered wood. The explosions staggered the attackers, but did not stop them. They kept moving. He adjusted. "Add 100 meters." The response was immediate. Another volley. Closer this time. Fragments tore through branches overhead. Shockwaves rippled through the ground. German troops dropped, but others filled the gaps, pressing forward. The sergeant crawled back beside him. "They're still coming!" He knew they would. 600 men could absorb casualties and still maintain momentum. He looked at the map again. He was running out of space. The Germans were now within 30 meters. He could see their faces clearly between the trees, white camouflage streaked with mud, breath steaming in the air. Some were shouting, others advanced silently, rifles steady. The perimeter was seconds from collapse. He pressed the radio again. "Battery, drop 50 meters." There was a long pause this time. "Confirm. That is danger close." Danger close. The term carried weight. It meant friendly forces were within lethal radius. It meant fragments could kill their own men. It meant the margin for error was nearly zero. He swallowed once. "Confirmed. Drop 50." The next barrage came in like a hammer from the sky. Explosions detonated just beyond the American foxholes. The blast pressure knocked men flat against frozen ground. Snow and debris rained down. Shrapnel sliced through tree trunks with vicious precision. German attackers were thrown backward, some disappearing entirely in the smoke. For a brief moment, the assault faltered. But still, unbelievably, small groups continued pushing through the chaos, using the explosions as cover, determined to break the line before the artillery could adjust again. The Observer's heart pounded in his ears. He did the final calculation. Distance to enemy, distance to friendly foxholes, spread pattern of 105mm shells, wind drift, elevation variance. There was no more room left to give. If he adjusted again, the shells would land on top of them. He looked around at the men nearby. Some were reloading with shaking hands. Others pressed themselves flat into craters. One young private was whispering something under his breath, maybe a prayer, maybe just a way to steady himself. If the Germans overran this position now, they would capture everything. Maps, codes, the road behind them. He knew what had to be done. He lifted the microphone one final time. "Battery, fire for effect on my position." Silence. Then the reply, strained and disbelieving. "Confirm on your position?" He didn't hesitate. "Confirmed. Fire." There was no time to think beyond that. He dropped into the shallow depression of his foxhole and pulled his helmet tight. The world exploded. The first shells landed directly within their perimeter. The blast was deafening, a pressure wave that crushed air from lungs and drove men into the frozen earth. Snow vaporized into white clouds. Soil, steel, and splintered timber filled the sky. More shells followed, and more, a continuous, merciless barrage. Tree trunks snapped like matchsticks. Shock waves rolled across the forest floor. The ground shook violently with each detonation. American riflemen flattened themselves against the earth, trusting that the calculations were correct, that the shells would land just beyond their bodies, not directly upon them. German troops caught mid-assault had nowhere to run. The tight encirclement turned into chaos. Units lost cohesion. Officers were killed or thrown off their feet. Communications shattered under the roar of steel. Some German soldiers tried to retreat. Others froze in place, unable to move under the relentless bombardment. The observer's heart pounded in his ears. He did the final calculation. Distance to enemy. Distance to friendly foxholes, spread pattern of 105mm shells, wind drift, elevation variance. There was no more room left to give. If he adjusted again, the shells would land on top of them. He looked around at the men nearby. Some were reloading with shaking hands. Others pressed themselves flat into craters. One young private was whispering something under his breath, maybe a prayer. Maybe just a way to steady himself. If the Germans overran this position now, they would capture everything. Maps, codes, the road behind them. He knew what had to be done. He lifted the microphone one final time. "Battery, fire for effect on my position." Silence. Then the reply, strained and disbelieving. "Confirm on your position?" He didn't hesitate. "Confirmed. Fire." There was no time to think beyond that. He dropped into the shallow depression of his foxhole and pulled his helmet tight. The world exploded. The first shells landed directly within their perimeter. The blast was deafening, a pressure wave that crushed air from lungs and drove men into the frozen earth. Snow vaporized into white clouds. Soil, steel, and splintered timber filled the sky. More shells followed, and more, a continuous, merciless barrage. Tree trunks snapped like matchsticks. Shock waves rolled across the forest floor. The ground shook violently with each detonation. American riflemen flattened themselves against the earth, trusting that the calculations were correct, that the shells would land just beyond their bodies, not directly upon them. German troops caught mid-assault had nowhere to run. The tight encirclement turned into chaos. Units lost cohesion. Officers were killed or thrown off their feet. Communications shattered under the roar of steel. Some German soldiers tried to retreat. Others froze in place, unable to move under the relentless bombardment. The observer's heart pounded in his ears. He did the final calculation. Distance to enemy. Distance to friendly foxholes, spread pattern of 105mm shells, wind drift, elevation variance. There was no more room left to give. If he adjusted again, the shells would land on top of them. He looked around at the men nearby. Some were reloading with shaking hands. Others pressed themselves flat into craters. One young private was whispering something under his breath, maybe a prayer. Maybe just a way to steady himself. If the Germans overran this position now, they would capture everything. Maps, codes, the road behind them. He knew what had to be done. He lifted the microphone one final time. "Battery, fire for effect on my position." Silence. Then the reply, strained and disbelieving. "Confirm on your position?" He didn't hesitate. "Confirmed. Fire." There was no time to think beyond that. He dropped into the shallow depression of his foxhole and pulled his helmet tight. The world exploded. The first shells landed directly within their perimeter.
For a few long seconds after the last shell landed, there was nothing. No rifle fire, no shouted commands, no advancing boots in the snow. only a low ringing in the ears of every man still alive. The artillery barrage had torn the forest apart. Where orderly rows of winter trees had stood that morning, there were now shattered trunks, splintered branches, and smoking craters. Snow had turned gray and black. The clean white silence of the Ardennes was gone, replaced by the scorched aftermath of steel and fire. The forward observer slowly lifted his head from the frozen earth. His helmet was dented, his uniform was crusted with mud and frost, his ears throbbed from concussion. For a moment the world felt distant, as if he were looking at it through glass. Then sound returned. Moans, coughing, someone calling for a medic. He pushed himself upright and scanned the perimeter. The American position had been mangled by its own salvation. Foxholes were half collapsed, sandbags had disintegrated. A machine gun lay overturned, its barrel bent by shrapnel. 2 men were dragging a wounded comrade toward what remained of the aid station. But beyond the smoke, beyond the broken trees, something else was visible. Movement. Not forward, backward. German troops were retreating. The artillery strike had not merely slowed the assault, it had shattered its momentum. Units that had been pressing aggressively only minutes earlier were now disorganized, scattered, and pulling back into deeper cover. The tight ring of encirclement had cracked. The sergeant crawled up beside the observer, face streaked with soot. "They're falling back, sir. I think we broke them." The observer didn't answer immediately. He was watching carefully, scanning for signs of another push. Sometimes artillery created temporary shock, only for an enemy to regroup and charge again. But this was different. The German formation had lost cohesion. Officers had been hit. Machine gun nests that were about to overrun the perimeter had been obliterated. Mortar crews had abandoned their tubes. The steel storm had been too much. He raised the radio again, hands still shaking from impact. "Battery, this is observer. Shift fire 200 meters north. Keep pressure on retreating units." The reply came quickly, clearer now. "Copy, adjusting." Moments later, new shells screamed overhead, this time landing safely beyond the American position, hammering the forest where German troops were attempting to regroup. The initiative had shifted. For the first time since the encirclement began, the Americans were no longer simply surviving, they were pushing the enemy back. But victory did not feel triumphant. It felt fragile. The observer stood slowly, ignoring the sharp pain in his side, likely shrapnel or bruised ribs from the blast waves. Around him, the cost of the decision was becoming painfully clear. One foxhole had taken a direct fragment hit. 2 soldiers lay still inside, their sacrifice indistinguishable from the devastation around them. Near the shattered machine gun position, a medic worked frantically over another wounded man, pressing bandages against a torn shoulder. Friendly artillery had saved them. It had also wounded them. That was the brutal arithmetic of danger close. There was no clean solution in war, only trade-offs measured in lives. As smoke thinned, reconnaissance patrols cautiously moved forward, stepping through craters and broken branches. They advanced slowly, rifles raised, scanning for wounded German soldiers or hidden resistance. What they found confirmed the scale of what had happened. The German assault force, nearly 600 strong at the start of the encirclement, had suffered devastating losses in the final barrage. Bodies lay scattered between trees, equipment was abandoned, mortar tubes were twisted and overturned, ammunition crates burned in shallow pits. The encirclement had not just failed, it had collapsed. Back at the American position, the observer took a long breath and finally allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had done. He had called artillery on his own coordinates. He had deliberately placed his men inside a kill zone.
and it had worked. But success did not erase the risk. If the calculations had been off by even a small margin, if the wind drift had shifted slightly, the story would have ended very differently. The sergeant approached again. "Sir, we're picking up friendly movement west of here. Might be our reinforcements." The observer turned toward the sound. Through the distant forest came faint engine noise. Not German armor, different rhythm, different tone. American. Word had spread along surviving communication lines that isolated units were still holding. Command elements behind the breakthrough had reorganized and were pushing cautiously forward to reconnect shattered sectors. The stand in this small forest bought time, precious hours. Hours that allowed reserves to reposition, artillery batteries to relocate safely, and defensive lines to solidify behind the German thrust. The broader offensive, what the world would later know as the Battle of the Bulge, was still raging across the Ardennes. Entire towns were changing hands. Thousands of soldiers were fighting in snow-choked valleys and frozen fields. But here, in this isolated pocket, something critical had shifted. Momentum. German doctrine relied on speed and shock. Break through, disrupt, encircle, advance before the enemy could stabilize. This position had interrupted that rhythm. 600 soldiers expected to overrun a weakened American unit quickly. Instead, they had been halted by a storm of steel summoned by a single voice over a radio. As reinforcements finally approached, cautious infantry moving through the wreckage, they were stunned by what they saw. Cratered ground, shattered forest, American soldiers still standing amid devastation. An officer stepped forward from the relief unit, eyes wide. Who called that fire mission? The sergeant gestured quietly toward the observer. The officer looked at him for a long moment, not with celebration, but with a kind of stunned disbelief. "You dropped it on yourselves?" The observer nodded once. There was nothing heroic in his expression, only exhaustion. War had stripped the moment of drama. What remained was consequence. Medics from the relief column immediately began evacuating the wounded. Stretchers moved carefully through uneven terrain. Engineers started assessing the road beyond, checking for mines and ambushes. The observer finally allowed himself to sit down against a splintered tree trunk. His hands were still trembling, the delayed reaction to adrenaline and concussion. Snowflakes settled on his shoulders. The ringing in his ears faded slowly into a dull ache. Around him, his men were alive. Not all of them, but enough. The line had held. The German advance in this sector had been stopped cold. And somewhere beyond the forest, larger forces were already regrouping to push back the offensive entirely. History would later analyze this battle in terms of divisions, corps movements, supply shortages, and strategic miscalculations. But in this small clearing, none of that mattered. What mattered was that when surrounded by 600 enemy soldiers, when surrender seemed logical and retreat impossible, one decision had changed the outcome. The steel storm had come, and they had endured it. The observer closed his eyes briefly, letting the cold air steady him. The battle was not over, but the encirclement was broken, and the forest, torn apart by artillery, stood as silent witness to the cost of holding the line.
By the second night after the encirclement was broken, the forest had grown quiet again. Not peaceful, just quiet. The thunder of artillery had moved farther east as American forces reorganized and began pushing back against the German offensive. The smoke had thinned. Snow continued to fall, slowly covering the craters and broken trees, softening the scars of battle. But beneath that fresh layer of white lay the cost. Stretcher teams moved carefully along the narrow forest paths, carrying the wounded toward field aid stations. Some men would recover, Others would not survive the night. Frostbite claimed almost as many as bullets. Exhaustion hollowed out faces that had aged years in a matter of days. The forward artillery observer sat on an overturned ammunition crate near a makeshift command post. His side had been bandaged. His hearing was still dulled from concussion. A medic had insisted he rest. Rest felt foreign. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, the final grid coordinates, the confirmation over the radio, the word fire. He had known the mathematics. He had accepted the risk, but acceptance did not erase memory. An officer from regimental headquarters arrived the following morning, escorted by 2 infantrymen. He had come to assess the position and gather reports. He walked slowly through the devastation, boots crunching on frozen debris, eyes scanning the shattered forest. When he reached the observer, he removed his gloves and extended a hand. "I've read the preliminary account," he said quietly. "You called the strike yourself?" The observer nodded. Enemy within 30 meters, no room left. The officer studied him for a long moment. "You understand what would have happened if that position had fallen?" He did. Behind their sector ran a narrow but critical road, one of the few viable supply routes through that part of the Ardennes. If 600 German soldiers had broken through there, they could have rolled up adjacent units from behind. More encirclements, more collapses. The bulge in the Allied line could have widened further. In those first chaotic days of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, time was everything. Holding for even a few hours mattered, and they had held. The officer placed a hand on his shoulder briefly, not ceremonial, not dramatic, just human. "You bought us time, a lot of it." The official reports would later describe the artillery strike in measured language, phrases like danger close fire mission, extreme proximity, decisive defensive action. Paper had a way of draining emotion from events. But the men who had been there knew the truth. They had felt the earth explode beneath them. They had pressed their faces into frozen ground and hoped the calculations were right. They had survived a storm summoned by their own side. Recognition did not come immediately. The war did not pause to honor isolated acts of courage. The German offensive continued for weeks. Entire divisions fought in towns like Bastogne. Supply lines were stretched thin. Casualties mounted across the Ardennes. The observer returned to duty as soon as he was physically able. There was no parade, no speech, just more coordinates, more calculations, more radio transmissions sent into the cold winter air. But word spread. Among artillery units, among infantry companies, stories travel quickly in war, especially the ones that sound impossible. "Did you hear about the guy who dropped shells on his own position?" Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others simply nodded, understanding the brutal logic of it. Military historians would later compare such actions to the sacrifice of officers like John R. Fox, who during World War II also called artillery on his own location to stop advancing German forces. In those moments, the individual disappears into the calculation. Survival becomes secondary to the mission. Courage, in those cases, is not loud. It is precise. It is measured in meters. Months later, when the German offensive had finally failed and Allied forces resumed their march into Germany, citations began to be written. Witness statements were gathered, maps were reviewed, radio logs were examined. The language of valor is careful. It must be, because it attempts to define something nearly indescribable, the decision to risk everything for others. The observer never described his action as heroic. He described it as necessary. There is a difference. Heroism suggests drama, spotlight, applause. Necessity suggests inevitability. In his mind,
The options had been simple: do nothing and allow 600 enemy soldiers to overrun the position, capture critical routes, and endanger countless others, or act and accept the possibility of death in the process. He had chosen to act. Years later, veterans from that battered unit would still speak about the day the sky fell on them. They remembered the sound first, the incoming shells tearing through frozen air. They remembered the shock wave that felt like the earth itself was splitting open. They remembered the silence afterward, and they remembered looking up and realizing they were still alive. War often celebrates grand strategies, sweeping offensives, famous generals. Maps with arrows and bold lines dominate textbooks. But wars are also shaped by moments so small they fit inside a single radio transmission. A voice, a coordinate, a confirmation. In the Ardennes winter of 1944, surrounded by 600 enemy soldiers, one such transmission altered the course of the battlefield. The forest eventually healed. Trees grew back through cratered soil. Snow melted. Spring returned to Belgium. Civilians rebuilt homes damaged by artillery and tanks. The scars of the Battle of the Bulge faded into history. But for the men who lay in that frozen clearing, the memory never softened. They had faced surrender. They had faced annihilation. And instead, they had endured a storm of their own making. The cost of courage is rarely visible from a distance. It is carried quietly, in ringing ears, in scar tissue, in memories replayed long after the guns fall silent. Yet because of that cost, others lived. Because of that decision, the line held. And sometimes, in the chaos of war, that is enough.